Imagine being arrested, not for stealing, not for fighting, but simply for staying up past bedtime. Sounds ridiculous, right? But in 14th century England, that was a real possibility. Once the church bells rang out across the village, it was more than just a signal to wind down the day. It was a strict warning. Fires had to be extinguished, candles snuffed, and everyone was expected to be in bed. If you were caught with a light still burning or wandering the streets after dark, you could face a fine, public punishment, or worse. This wasn't about health. It wasn't even just about fire safety. This was about controlling when people worked, when they rested, and even when they dreamed. Authorities feared the night. The darkness made people harder to monitor. They believed sign crept in after sunset, and rebellion could be born under moonlight. But how did a simple bedtime become a matter of law? Who made these rules and who broke them? What was so dangerous about staying up a little too late? Let's step into the world of medieval curfews, moral panic, and bedtime laws so strict they could ruin your life. Long before alarm clocks or electric lights, the setting sun dictated everything. In 14th century England, nightfall didn't just mean the end of the day, it triggered a legal obligation. Towns across the country enforced a curfew that was taken deadly seriously. The word curfew itself comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. It wasn't just a friendly reminder to get some rest, it was the law. At dusk, a bell would toll through the streets, signaling that all hearth fires had to be covered or extinguished. Every home was expected to go dark. No flames, no lanterns, no candles. The reasoning: fire prevention. Entire towns were built from timber and thatch, essentially tinderboxes waiting for a spark. A single stray ember could set off a chain reaction that wiped out dozens of homes. So shutting down the night wasn't optional, it was a matter of survival. But the curfew quickly evolved into something more. Authorities realized that with no light and no heat, people would naturally go to bed, and once they were asleep, they were easier to control. What began as a public safety measure quietly transformed into a system of behavioral regulation. Bedtime became mandated by bells, and the simple act of staying awake too long could mark you as suspicious. Soon, it wasn't just about the fire, it was about obedience. Staying up late became a symbol of defiance, even if all you were doing was talking with neighbors, working late, or reading by candlelight. In the eyes of the law, that kind of independence was dangerous. And so, the bedtime bell wasn't just the end of the day, it was the beginning of a curfew culture that ruled over the rhythms of daily life. If the government enforced curfews, the church made sure people felt guilty for even questioning them. In medieval England, bedtime wasn't just a civic duty, it was framed as a moral obligation. Sleep, they said, was a sign of virtue, but staying up late, that was the devil's domain. Priests preached that idleness invited sin, and those who lingered past dusk were opening themselves up to spiritual danger. Night, in the eyes of the church, was a time of temptation. It was in the darkness, they warned, that lust crept in, that impure thoughts flourished, that evil whispered in the quiet. Even simple things like chatting by the fire or walking under the moon were looked at with suspicion, and it wasn't just about personal sin. The church also feared communal corruption. One person staying up late could influence others, spread gossip, spark scandals, or worse, lead souls astray. Sermons warned of nocturnal behaviors that weren't just immoral, but contagious. The message was clear: good Christians went to sleep when they were told. Anyone who didn't might be hiding something, or harboring sin. This blending of faith and law created an atmosphere where people didn't just fear punishment, they feared judgment. Breaking curfew wasn't just dangerous, it was shameful. Entire communities became quiet not just because of rules, but because of pressure. No one wanted to be the only one with a candle flickering in the window after the bell had rung. And so, the church helped reinforce the curfew with something even more powerful than fines: guilt. It wasn't enough to go to bed early, you had to believe it was the righteous thing to do. Because in medieval England, sleep was next to godliness. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the sound of bells echoed through the narrow, cobbled streets. It wasn't just a signal to go home, it was a command. That bell marked the beginning of curfew. It meant the day was over, the fire must be smothered, the lights extinguished, and silence enforced. But not everyone went to bed. Some stayed up for a very different reason. They were called the night watch, dressed in cloaks, carrying staffs or torches. These men patrolled the sleeping town like guardians of order or enforcers of fear. Their job was simple: ensure obedience. If they saw light in a window, they knocked. If they heard voices, they demanded answers. And if they caught you outside after the curfew bell, you were in trouble. It didn't matter if you were heading home late from work or tending to a sick relative. Breaking curfew was breaking the law. Some towns issued steep fines. Others humiliated violators in public, forcing them into the stocks or making them confess at Sunday Mass. In repeat cases, offenders could be jailed overnight just for being awake when they weren't supposed to be, and the laws extended beyond the streets. Taverns and inns were required to close their doors early, long before the night truly began. Landlords who dared to serve ale after curfew risked losing their license or worse, being labelled as harbourers of sin. Even guests could be held responsible if they were caught lingering. The night watch didn't just walk the streets. They listened, they looked, they judged. In many places, neighbours were encouraged to report those who defied the bedtime laws. A flicker of candlelight or the echo of laughter after hours could bring the guards to your door. People learned to fear the night not because of what lurked in the darkness, but because of who enforced it. Curfew didn't fall equally on everyone. Like most laws in medieval England, bedtime rules had a hidden hierarchy. If you were rich, powerful, or connected, you could afford to bend the rules. But if you were poor, female, or a servant, you were expected to obey without question. For the lower classes, curfew wasn't just a guideline. It was an iron rule. Peasants were expected to shut down their homes the moment the bell rang. Servants had to retire early and report to their masters at dawn. In many households, a head servant was tasked with enforcing sleep schedules within the home, making sure no one stayed up wasting oil or inviting temptation. But it was worse for women. A woman found outside after dark, even if she had a valid reason, was immediately suspect. People whispered, they assumed the worst. In the eyes of the law, a woman wandering at night was often labelled as loose, troublesome, or even accused of prostitution regardless of her innocence. For unmarried women, the risks were higher still. A nighttime walk could damage a reputation permanently. Meanwhile, noblemen dined late, talked politics by candlelight, and paid guards to look the other way. Their homes glowed with warmth long after the curfew bell. Some even flaunted their defiance, using brightly lit halls as a symbol of status. Wealth gave them options. It bought silence, and when the law was enforced, it was always the same people who suffered. The poor couldn't pay the fines. The servants couldn't argue. Women couldn't speak up. In many towns, curfew was less about safety and more about reminding people of their place. It wasn't just a bedtime, it was a boundary line. And if you crossed it, the punishment came quickly. So, while some drifted to sleep in silk sheets and candlelight, others curled up in darkness, not just because they were tired, but because they were told to disappear. Behind the flickering lanterns and extinguished fires, there was something deeper driving these laws: fear. Not just fear of fire or sin, but fear of the people themselves. Because when the sun went down, the powerful could no longer see what the powerless were doing, and that terrified them. In 14th century England, the night was more than a time to sleep, it was a time of opportunity. The darkness gave cover to those who wanted to meet in secret. Whispered alliances, forbidden love affairs, hushed plans for rebellion, they all happened after curfew. And the ruling class knew it. History had taught them that trouble brewed in the shadows. Peasant revolts, small uprisings, even religious heresies often began under the cover of night. A flickering candle in a neighbour's home might mean nothing, or it might mean conspiracy. In towns where poverty and resentment simmered just below the surface, nighttime became a breeding ground for unrest. So, curfews weren't just about public safety, they were a preemptive strike against rebellion. If everyone was asleep, no one could organise. If the streets were empty, no one could gather. The bedtime bell became a silencing device, a signal that any attempt to resist, no matter how small, would be choked out before it had the chance to grow. And this fear seeped into the way laws were enforced. The night watch weren't just fire wardens, they were informants, enforcers. Their ears weren't just tuned to footsteps, but to voices, whispers of discontent. A group of men talking too long by a fire could be broken up. A gathering in a barn might be raided. Even families saying prayers too late could be questioned. To the authorities, a sleeping population was a safe one. Silence wasn't just peaceful, it was political, and sleep, once a natural act, became an expectation. Enforced with suspicion, rooted in fear. For all the strictness surrounding curfews and bedtime laws, there were always exceptions. As with most things in medieval life, if you had the right title, trade, or coin, the rules suddenly didn't seem quite so rigid. Take blacksmiths, for example. Because their work was often considered essential, especially for urgent horse fittings or weapon repairs, they were granted the rare privilege of working after hours. Midwives, too, were allowed to respond to nighttime births in many towns. They were the only women who could legally move through the streets after the bell. Even executioners, yes, really were permitted to prepare tools late into the night. If a hanging loomed at dawn, then there were the permits for the right price. Certain towns issued official exemptions. Nobles who wanted to host evening banquets could secure a written allowance to keep their halls glowing long into the night. Some families even applied for religious exemptions, citing all-night prayer vigils or ceremonial observances, though, in truth, many of these were thinly veiled excuses to throw lavish gatherings without interruption. And then there were the architectural loopholes. Wealthy homeowners began designing what were known as after-curfew rooms, sealed chambers with thick shutters and no exterior windows. These rooms, tucked deep within large estates, were used to host private conversations, study sessions, or romantic encounters without drawing the attention of the night watch. On the outside, the home appeared dark and compliant. But inside, life continued. Some even went further, using clever tricks to mimic darkness. Curtains layered with black fabric, doors stuffed with rags to block out light, candles hidden in hollowed out furniture. People became quite creative. And guards, well, guards could be paid off. A coin here, a favor there. The system may have been strict, but it was never incorruptible. These strange exceptions didn't just expose cracks in the law, they revealed who the laws were really for. Bedtime wasn't truly about safety or morality, it was about control. And those with power always found a way to stay awake. Despite the curfews, the bells, the patrols, and the guilt, not everyone obeyed. Some couldn't, others simply wouldn't, and what emerged was an entire culture of quiet defiance, ordinary people learning to live outside the law, even if just for a few stolen hours each night. Some of the earliest rule breakers were workers. Millers finishing late, bakers rising before dawn. They moved through alleyways with cloaks drawn tight, lanterns shielded in cloth, every step cautious. Then came the lovers, young couples meeting in hidden corners, under moonlight, or in stables, slipping past the eyes of nosy neighbors and suspicious guards. What started as necessity quickly turned into something more: resistance. People began creating spaces where curfew didn't reach. Barns just outside town, forest clearings known only to a few. Cellars with thick doors and no windows, where candles could burn without being seen. In these secret places, they talked, they sang, they planned, and sometimes they rebelled. Smugglers used the cover of night to move goods past sleeping checkpoints. Dissidents passed messages. Rebels plotted uprisings, and local legends began to spread stories of the woman who stayed up all night every night without getting caught, or the farmer who hosted forbidden gatherings in his hayloft. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were inspiration. Even in cities, people found loopholes. Some tied string to their door latches so they could sneak out and relock behind them. Others trained dogs to bark if the night watch approached. Children learned to blow out candles silently and quickly just in case. Breaking the bedtime laws wasn't just about fun. It became a form of quiet protest, a way to reclaim a piece of the night for themselves. For a people told when to work, when to worship, and when to sleep, defying curfew was a reminder that their lives didn't belong entirely to the bells, and in a world where dreams were regulated by law, simply staying awake became an act of rebellion. In 14th century England, going to sleep wasn't just expected, it was enforced. And the most unsettling part, you were being watched. Across towns and villages, Local authorities appointed special figures to make sure everyone obeyed the curfew. These weren't just passive guards patrolling the streets. Some communities went so far as to send sleep monitors or curfew men into neighborhoods to peer through windows, listen at doors, and report any sign of life after dark. Their job was to catch you not sleeping. If your candle flickered too long, if a child's voice whispered past bedtime, or if your chimney still emitted the faintest trail of smoke, you could be fined, questioned, or dragged in for disobedience. In some places, towns had designated quiet streets where absolute silence was expected after curfew. One cough, one creak of a wooden floorboard and your name might end up on a ledger, and it wasn't just the authorities watching. Neighbors were encouraged, sometimes even rewarded, for reporting violators. The same people you shared bread with during the day might betray your candlelight at night. It created a culture of suspicion, a world where everyone had to act like they were asleep. Even if they weren't, windows were covered with heavy cloth, floors padded with straw. Entire families would pretend to snore when they heard footsteps outside, just in case the night watch paused near their door. Parents hushed their children not for sleep's sake, but to avoid being turned in. This wasn't rest, it was a performance. A nightly routine of pretending to be asleep, not just to preserve your safety, but your reputation, because in a world where being awake could make you a target, you had to make sure your dreams were visible and your wakefulness invisible. In medieval England, even childhood wasn't a shield from the law. Bedtime rules didn't just apply to adults, they applied to everyone, including the smallest, most innocent members of society. Children were expected to be in bed by sundown, not just tucked in but silent, still, invisible. If a child was seen playing outside after curfew, or even peeking from behind curtains, it wasn't just the child who got in trouble. The entire family could be punished. Parents were held responsible for their children's obedience and punished if they failed to enforce the nightly routine. There are recorded cases where entire households were fined because a single child was caught looking out a window after dark. In some towns, mothers were scolded at church, shamed in public, or forced to perform penance if their children were seen as restless after bedtime. And it wasn't just about noise or mischief. The church taught that undisciplined sleep in children was a sign of poor moral upbringing. A child who wandered at night was thought to be spiritually vulnerable, open to evil influences, demons, or the sin of curiosity. That meant bedtime wasn't just enforced through rules, it was drilled into children through fear. Stories were told to scare them into sleep. Tales of shadowy figures who stole disobedient children in the night, or of demons that whispered to those who dared to stay awake. If you're not asleep, mothers warned, something will come for you. Even schools and monasteries enforced sleep through extreme discipline. Children in religious institutions were sometimes beaten for dozing at the wrong hour, for failing to sleep quickly enough. It was all about control. Get them young, train them to obey. Because in a world where silence equaled safety, even a child's yawn could become a threat. You might think that once people finally fell asleep, they were free, safe from judgment, beyond the reach of curfews, bells, and laws. But in 14th century England, not even your dreams were safe. The church believed that dreams weren't just random flickers of imagination, they were windows into your soul. What you saw while you slept could expose your deepest sins, your darkest urges, or even signs of demonic influence. Dreaming too vividly, that meant your mind was too active. And if you confessed to dreams that were violent, lustful, or rebellious, the consequences could be very real. Priests gave entire sermons warning against the dangers of dreaming. They said impure thoughts during sleep were a sign that your soul was under attack. Even the way you slept could draw suspicion. Sleeping on your back, for example, was rumored to invite sinful visions. The wrong posture might expose you to temptation, or worse, allow dark spirits to visit your body while unconscious. Dream confession became a strange part of religious life. People were encouraged to report troubling dreams during confession so they could receive spiritual cleansing, but that openness often backfired. There are records of people being punished, isolated, or forced into extended prayer because of what they dreamed, sometimes even accused of heresy or witchcraft. And for those with powerful imaginations, that was dangerous. Women who described vivid dreams were often labelled as unstable or worse, as vessels of the devil. A single disturbing dream could cast a long, suspicious shadow. So sleep wasn't just a place of rest, it was a test. Nightly trial you couldn't control, but could still be judged for, because in the 14th century, your thoughts didn't belong to you. Not even the ones that arrived when your eyes were closed, while ordinary people were forced into silence and sleep. The most powerful were just getting started behind the high stone walls of castles and noble estates. Justice didn't rest. In fact, some of the most important and most secretive decisions were made after dark. Midnight wasn't just a time of rest. It was a time of rulings, punishments, and silent power moves. They called them quiet sessions, private legal hearings held by lords or local elites, far from the eyes and ears of the public. No crowd, no outcry. Just whispered decisions made under TOCHLIGHT. Land disputes, family inheritances, trials for treason or blasphemy, even executions, were sometimes ordered during these late-night meetings. The cover of night allowed decisions to be made quickly and without interference. If a nobleman wanted to strip a rival of property or declare a marriage invalid, all it took was a candlelit session with the right officials behind closed doors. And while peasants were being fined for talking after curfew, lords were rewriting people's fates over wine and soft voices. Some towns even had official policies allowing emergency trials after sundown, but what counted as an emergency? That was decided by the ones in charge, which meant any matter, no matter how trivial, could be judged in darkness, with no record, no defense, and no appeal. In rare cases, those sentenced during the night never made it to morning. Their punishment was carried out before dawn. No witnesses, no trial transcripts, no names remembered. Just silence. It's a dark irony. While the commoners were being told that nighttime was dangerous, unholy, and full of sin, it was also when the most corrupt deals were made. Not in alleyways, but in courtrooms lit by flickering flames. In medieval England, justice didn't always sleep, but sometimes it did hide. By now, you've seen how medieval bedtime wasn't just about when people slept, but about how tightly their lives were controlled. And if you think the laws couldn't get any more ridiculous, let's talk about candle taxes. Yes, candlelight itself became a taxable offense in some towns. Not because it was expensive, not even because of fire safety, but because candles were considered evidence. If you owned too many, it meant one thing: you were probably staying up after curfew. Local officials began keeping track. In wealthier areas, households were required to report how many candles they bought or made. Special levies were added to luxury lighting, like beeswax candles, which burned longer and brighter than the cheaper tallow ones. Owning too many large candles raised eyebrows and suspicions. Worried citizens responded with creativity. Some began hoarding rushlights, quick-burning torches made of reeds dipped in fat. Others made secret compartments in their homes to hide candles during inspections. It became a cat-and-mouse game. The more the authorities tried to control the night, the more inventive people became in keeping it alive. In some villages, candle counters were appointed, yes, actual officials tasked with inspecting homes for illegal lighting. Their visits were unannounced. If they found too many wicks, or if a candle was still warm, that was enough to charge you with breaking curfew. And of course, as always, there were loopholes. Nobles could pay candle taxes in advance to avoid scrutiny. Clergy were usually exempt. But for the average peasant, even a little extra light became a risk, a potential crime. So think about that. In 14th century England, simply lighting a candle at the wrong time could cost you your freedom, your reputation, or your safety. Because, in a world so obsessed with control, even the smallest flame could spark fear. We often think of bedtime as a personal choice, a routine, a moment of peace. But in 14th century England, it was anything but. Sleep was mandated, enforced, weaponized, from the toll of the evening bell to the silent patrol of the night watch. Bedtime became a symbol of submission. It wasn't about rest. It was about control. The flicker of a candle, a child's whisper, a dream too vivid, all became reasons for punishment. Laws twisted into tools for obedience. Even the night itself wasn't safe while the poor were silenced. The powerful ruled in the shadows. So the next time you lie awake at night, with the freedom to think, dream, and exist in the dark. Remember that for centuries, that freedom was illegal. In medieval England, even your silence had to follow the rules.